do so. As mayor of Venice, I, who have had the privilege to run this city on behalf of a coalition which is a union ante litteram, cannot certainly impart lessons, but can bear witness of the possibility and effectiveness of crossbreeding between reforming and antagonist forces. As a reformer, I can say that the joining together of these forces can defeat the law of the pendulum, where the left wing gives hope when it is in opposition, but then make people fall into dejection when they're in power. It seemed that there could be a possibility of programs that were partly only coinciding, but we were not caught in opposing vetoes. And I'm referring to the 5 years in which I have headed this city. I have accepted compromise because none of the members of the coalition, though they have the right of upholding their positions, they were never asked to forego their ideals or their positions. But with respect to the ideals of others, we were never prevented from governing, from giving answers to our citizens. We knew that we disappointed some and made others happy, but we knew that our common effort, the effort of respecting our projects, our banners, our ideals, our compromises, our putting together of all our energies could lead to a responding to the needs of those we administered. So this cross-reading of the different forces, in my opinion, brought to more fruitful results. It was hard. It was a harsh debate. At the very last minute only we came to an agreement. But we were only rallied round at the end, but really it was possible in an administration such as Venice to achieve what it was aiming for. And the environmentalist or non-global movements who were also present in our assemblies. And so I'll just like to give you an example of this. It touches on a raw nerve, or it might touch a raw nerve in the relations between reformers and antagonists. Some months ago, in this very room, the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO was held, and I am not an utopian member of the peace movement, as Etrascola said. I have a nonviolent attitude. I think that there are many instruments that can be used, but I came to speak to the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, and other things were said out in the squares, and this was allowed by my administration. This was something that could not have been said either here or outside in the streets unless we had found together the right key towards saying the right things. And here, before the representatives of NATO, I spoke for the right of all those who had asked that weapons never be used. And in the streets, I asked all those who were demonstrating, even noisily, that they respect what was being said in this room. So without being prodded by the antagonists, I would have said different things. And without being prodded by the reformers, I would also have said different things. So we need to cover the common ground together. And I believe that this is the key that will make reformism and antagonism enter a phase in which antagonism and reformism crossbreed for the sake of the country and for a period that will last as long as possible for the good of all.
Ringraziamo il sindaco di Venezia per il suo...
Thank the mayor of Venice for his words of greeting. And now something which is not really customary to us in our congresses, but we give the floor to Mr. Fausto Bertinotti, just for a few words. This will be his main statement.
Cari compagni e cari compagni, sono nella condizione di...
Dear comrades, I am about to give ourselves a gift. At the beginning of this Congress, we have received an extraordinary present and gift, which is wonderful for all of us.
I doni non vanno sprecati.
Gifts should never go wasted. And so I shall just read to you the letter with this gift. The letter by Comrade Pietro Ingrao.
Possiamo tenerci il resto degli applausi per la fine.
But let's keep the rest of the cheers for later. Dear comrades, I am sending your Congress and all of you the warm and friendless wishes for success of the Congress. Unfortunately, my age and a number of important engagements have prevented me from participating in your debate. This is a time when dialogue and sharing views among comrades seems necessary and indeed a must. But this is not a letter from far away. Rather, with this letter, I ask you to join the ranks of your organization to participate in your struggle.
Tante volte
So many times in these difficult decades when we have suffered the experience of war coming to the forefront again, so many times in these years we met in the squares, in the streets, to march, to demand, to protect the rights of the workers, or to demand peace, which new American imperialism is threatening. I have often felt this brotherhood which goes far beyond the difference in names or membership. We have felt the deep emotion of huge marches of young people, a new generation marching ahead of us, struggling and crossing the borders of all continents. The whole world has talked about it, but almost at the same time we have seen that the superpower in the world is bringing war back to the world, and indeed talking about preemptive war accompanied by a bloody and bloodthirsty terrorism going beyond social conflict. And a difficult question arises: how do we expand the struggle to liberate the oppressed while defending peace in the world also from the terrorist attacks? And at this point I feel an urgent demand for new politics and legislation. How can we make a difference and influence those powers which have legitimacy to rule, sometimes through fraud, but on the basis of a legal system, sometimes through fraud in this system, but giving powers and instruments to guide and rule nations and continents. And at this point, I feel the urgent question about how to act politically, how to influence the power of nation states and empires which have such terrible and new instruments in their hands which can decide about life and death. Just as your secretary, in my thinking I have come across a thirst and quest and hope for non-violence, and the whole approach to politics have taken a new face and a new unavoidable shape. This will probably explain why now I'm asking to become a member of your party. Again, I have chosen to have such a strong bond with something which for many years had been part of my life. Best wishes for your work, Pietro Ingrao. Thank you, Pietro.
כבוד הנשיא, זה מכתב והלוואי שתקרא בשעת פנאי מה כתב כל מוסי. אדוני הנשיא, קיבלתי הצו האומר עד יום ו' לעזוב לחזית ולצאת אל הקרב.
Dear President, I write to you and I hope you will read these words that I feel and that I will say, that I feel, and to say why I have said that I shall not be there.
Had only troubles from when I was born, and the kids that I raised have cried with me. My mother and father are already under the earth, and they don't care anything about the war. While I was in prison, somebody stole my wife and my past. That part of my life is finished. Tomorrow I will rise, close the door on the dead, season, and walk away.
Vivrò di carità sulle strade di Spagna, di Francia e di Bretagna, e a tutti griderò di non partire più.
And I will ask everyone, do not obey, do not accept to go and die, no matter whom. If necessary, if blood is needed, donate your own blood if that is fine for you. And tell your people, if they come and look for me, you can shoot me, but I shall not hold a weapon. I have no weapons.
Ringraziamo il
We thank Fabio Polese, Alice, and the American pacifist, and the Israeli refusenik. And now I would like to give the floor to the National Secretary of our party for the introductory paper.
Sarah works in the world of the web. Her story was told by Aldo Nove, a journalist for the newspaper Liberazione. Sarah's story is similar to that of many more young people who felt the illusion of a new world. It didn't mean a new job, but rather new illusions, old expectations for a future that never was. If you ask Sarah how she's doing, she tells you terribly. Why? I'm fed up to live with anxiety, always. This time I didn't really expect to be treated in such an inhuman way. I was dismissed yet again. I was given the sack. Or rather, for the umpteenth time, I had been promised I'd be hired and then wasn't. This is the experience of casual workers, and it's insufferable. We should memorize it. It's the story of a generation. Our children, young people at the time of globalization and neoliberalism, and the capitalism of our time. She was looking for a job, a traditional job, then a net job in the net economy, hoping for a future that never is, a little pay, then no more work, and then being dismissed, then temping, manpower agencies, uncertainty. That's the end of the story. I was promised a job and never hired. For 3 months I suffered mobbing for nothing. I would come home and cry. I was just hoping for a job, but that job never came. And yet, up to the very last minute, I was told that I would get a new contract. Then the temping agency calls me. What do they suggest? A 10 days contract for the same company. 10 days. I got angry. They said, well, we'll try and do some more. We'll get some more. This time, a better contract. Another week passes. They call back, and they suggest another contract. It's no longer 10 days, but 15 days. A nightmare. I felt deeply offended. And here I am, trying to cope with this or that odd job. Nothing in my hands, no perspective, no future. Politically, Sarah, where do you stand? Well, for years, I was a left-winger. I believed in the left and the values and ideas of the left. And now? Well, for some time, I have not believed in anything. Well, I think our first primary task is to give all the Sarahs of this world a new confidence in the left, to restore her ability to believe in politics as something that can deal with your actual daily life and concrete experience and social and human condition. Sarahs should be given back the desire and possibility to participate in politics in order to change life and the world. Sarah has thrown a beam of light on the crisis of politics, and to overcome this crisis we should start from Sarah's condition. The way out of this maze is the relationship between work and the life of human beings, between human beings and the organization of society. Everything has changed. It is a new cycle, very different from what we had experienced in the whole post-war period. But it is not true that in this new cycle labor is expendable. We are at the end of labor. It is not so. Indeed, blue-collar work has increased in recent years, and the absolute thrust towards competitiveness and competition by all the ruling class shows how important labor is in capitalist accumulation in these recent years. And these changes have not improved the condition of workers. The material evidence is there. In the unionized countries, the new generations entering the labor market are worse off than the previous generations. It's the first time ever in contemporary history, for the first time, social progress has come to a standstill. There is a setback in the civilization of labor. Huge changes are taking place. Some are unexpected. Capitalist accumulation is growing without a parallel growth of a unified, homogeneous working class. Indeed, labor is shattered and fragmented. That is a new trend. What has been called a knowledge-based economy, it has not generated a process of liberation, but organic inequality, almost essential inequality. Recent capitalism does disseminate knowledge, but this knowledge is related to a social organization where labor suffers a hierarchy and is fragmented. Knowledge is used in the work process, but it is organized and recognized in work organization only at the top of the pyramid, while there is less and less knowledge in the lower strata and layers of the pyramid. And indeed, in the lowest layers, people do not have names, they're just numbers. Raniero Panzieri used to write about machinism in the early 60s. And he had guessed that technology with capitalism does do away with the old division of labor, but reintroduces a new division of labor as a form of labor exploitation, which he wrote is even more disgusting. And he was right. If we analyze the effect of the electronic revolution under the influence of capitalist globalization, we see this. It is a process replacing industrial labor of a mechanic type towards the network production, from Taylorism to digital Taylorism. Workers are asked to use their minds as though it was an artificial intelligence machine. It is a new bondage which goes all the way, workers and consumers. And capitalism with digital Taylorism separates the product from the holders and the workers. Quality and rights are denied. Information is introduced into the economic cycle as a commodity, and this draws value from a huge quantity of work accumulated in the social tissue without paying it. There is a huge quantity of living labor absorbed into the new machine, while a growing part of human activity becomes part of capitalist accumulation, but it is not acknowledged or recognized. So wage labor expands to every form of human activity. As Marx had expected, the commodification of every human activity is moving forward. At the same time, the structure of enterprises have changed. The relationship between more investment and jobs is problematic. Full employment no longer means stable and guaranteed jobs. The trade-off which is demanded for employment is job insecurity, flexibility. You can have a job and be poor, the working poor. And indeed, job insecurity, casual work is a symbol of a new social condition. And this insecurity expands to every human activity. It's your own life which is insecure. It is a new form of work organization fed by the neoliberal policies of states, governments, and supranational institutions of the economy. It is fed by the primacy of finance, where the market rationale concerns every aspect of decision-making. And this insecurity is a social result of that capitalist revolution, which indeed means a setback, and which is globalization. The struggle against this insecurity, against this casualization, is a necessary foundation to move beyond this state of affairs, to build an alternative society, an alternative world. But we should ask two questions. In what kind of society does the conflict take place? Against whom? And what? What kind of relationship should be developed when developing an alternative? with, what kind of a relationship with modernity? These are highly challenging questions, but we must answer them. Our challenge to reformists is a consequence of the kind of answer we give to these questions. We're just beginning to answer these questions. We can contribute to find an answer together with all those entities and people who are making this effort. Can we still talk about capitalism? Can we still use the word capitalism to define the society where we live? We believe that not only we can, but indeed we should, if we want to give some meaning to a reformist policy. But what kind of capitalism are we talking about? I could be asked a rather naive question. Nowadays, in Italy today, is there more, less, or the same amount of capitalism in Italy today than there was 30 years ago in Italy? I would say there is more capitalism now. If ever there was a golden age of capitalism, that is behind our backs, is past and gone. It was a kind of age where there was a democratic compromise which had been won after the victory against Nazism and fascism, helped by the presence of the camp of real socialism. It was a democratic compromise that had been won through class struggle and democratic struggle of the labor movement. Now, what we see are systematic attacks against the welfare state, against the bargaining power of the workers, against social legislation, against any form of public intervention in the economy. It is a predator type of capitalism. It is a modern way to go back to the to 19th century patterns. If possible, they would like to have work without workers, without the subjectivity of the workers. But this cannot be. And so modern capitalism tried to demolish the power of the workers to build coalitions, to join forces, which is a principle of conflict, which is the power of the oppressed, which is the very root of modern politics. Insecurity and casualization is the structural foundation of the denial of this possibility of the workers to get organized. And the legislation adopted by neoliberal governments are trying to follow this. They're trying to deny the political nature of labor issues. For them, social conflict is a disease. Trade union matters are just specific and sectoral affairs, and technology is the interpretation of culture. And they're challenging all the elements of our civilization: wages, working time, control over work. The very rights of the workers are dependent variables. They depend on competition and competitiveness. They cannot tolerate that capitalism has limits, because this capitalism is a predator and it is flexible and unstable. Risk exposure has to be paid for by society, but in this way democracy is no longer participation or people's sovereignty, but democracy suffers, and politics is swallowed by capitalist economy. What has happened in the Italy of Berlusconi's government? Precisely this, if it were not for the struggle and resistance and conflict of movements. And that is the content that we find even in the European Constitutional Treaty, though that we do not have a primacy of the right wing there. And there is a political consequence of this. In order to carry out a policy of reforms, this must be rooted in an antagonist social force, rooted in the new social condition of oppression and alienation, building a new unity. ultra-modern capitalism proves that Marx was right when he said that capitalism is trying to dominate over everything. But capitalism cannot absorb everything, he said. But there is something which we had believed in for a long time and which is no longer true. We thought that capitalism would per se produce a unity of labor. It is not so. Modern capitalist development has fragments and isolate work and workers, labor and the workers. So we have to unify what capitalism divides. It's a very hard and challenging task. It concerns the force of the workers, wage earners, salary earners, retirees, self-employed workers, and all the workers seeking for creativity and self-rule. We have we should find a unity among those who have a stable job and those who are casual workers. May the 1st, the activities of the labor movement and the May Day movement of young people. In the Metal Workers Union, the most important industrial union in Italy, had understood this during the time of the Genoa Social Forum. They understood that there must be a new unity with social movements. But a lot of work still has to be done. A new labor movement has to be built through a new social and political actor. It is not something that just concerns the economy. There must be unity among different actors and players who represent different cultures. And this is something that we should carry out every day. Giorgio Agamben was writing about what is necessary to for a constituent process of the proletariat. In other words, merging together and finding a relationship among different cultures and subjectivities. But as feminist thinking has taught us that labor will not change unless we change a relationship between production and reproduction, between men and women. Environmentalists have taught us that labor will not change if it does not change a relationship with nature, and vice versa. We had come to a conclusion which is now the very pillar of our strategy. It's the only way to stop the extreme forms of exploitation of modern capitalism. We need a new alliance holding together the liberation of labor, holding together the liberation of labor and the liberation from labor, from working. There should be a new relationship between labor conflicts and social movements. There's another challenging question. It concerns the intrinsic nature of the technical revolution that characterizes neoliberal globalization, the so-called knowledge-based economy. Huge expectations had been felt about this, criticizing the notion that science and technology is neutral. This is a major heritage, or rather legacy, of the class struggle and student struggle of the late 60s. But now a new form of technology innovation had come to the front, and it was considered as proactive, as making people active and not passive. And many people thought that this would be new. Among the left as well, I have no objection to those who are trying to explore all the possible ways to innovate and change the system. I can understand you feel fascinated by it. This happens to great people too. For example, it happened to Gramsci when he wrote Americanism and Fordism. But now we should come to terms with the fact that the expectations of reformers have been betrayed by the actual developments of events, and so-called knowledge-based economy has been transformed into a paradox where knowledge is commodified, is transformed into a commodity, and wages are increasingly cut. And the two factors together, the wage cuts and the commodification of knowledge, are accompanied, march hand in hand with a systematic exclusion of people from the circles of power. This is a development which is based on exclusion, and this process challenges civilization. And the ideas that come to mind is the writers who wrote about the crisis of civilization before the Weimar Republic: Walter Benjamin, Georgi Lukács, Bernstein, Karl Korsch, Martin Buber. There's an increasing gap between the technical scientific potential of the tools and the instruments and the culture of the populations. It is a tragic state of affairs. Positivists believed that technical and scientific development would lead to progress, to some advances. And yet now the cultures of peoples, which are the greatest asset of humankind, these cultures are under attack and with major setbacks. We see the cultural impoverishment of all populations, and we find it day after day. We make comments about the sports of the fact that sports and culture and politics and daily life is no longer what it used to be. The relative knowledge disseminated in society is impoverished. There is a gap between what we actually know and knowledge in general. There's a destructive consequence of this on what we call conscience. And this undermines democracy. This is a factor of crisis in the social control over science, technology, and decision makers. Electronic technology are highly powerful and pervasive. There's extended access and frequent use, but they have not produced an expansion of social knowledge and social culture, because this can only be the result of complex experiences and interactions through direct or indirect relations among human beings, through participation, through communities, through an expanded scientific community. Technical innovation has not produced the expansion of social knowledge. It has produced a paradox of time, which is the acceleration in the circuit of information and the amount of information available. But at the same time, we have less and less time to process this information, to think about it, to reason, to use our minds. We could panic about this, and we lose the sense and the meaning of our actions. In the upper layers of a population, new potentials are acquired, new space for creativity. But all the others, as workers, as consumers, are increasingly impoverished in their relations and human interactions. That is also one of the ways to create insecurity and precariousness and casualization. Culture, art, and research are increasingly commodified. They are transformed into commodities, while education is marginalized. Commodification of knowledge, casualization of labor are extremes in this kind of capitalist accumulation in the West. But can we talk about the West? This is a historical turning point. Hyper-modern capitalism has also developed something new compared to the history of the West. Claudio Napoleone said that for liberation to occur, we should have a different perspective on the relationship between human beings and the world. And the perspective should be different from the perspective of production, appropriation, domination. I don't know if we can use the notion of West, but certainly if we can, the nomos, the symbol of it, as Carl Schmitt said, is this triad: appropriation, production, domination. But in innovation, in society, in the world, this paradigm is frightening, because it is frightening when brought to its extreme consequence. Europe is not a mythical figure. It is this Europe. It has gone through the tragedies caused by European colonialism. Europe has experienced a horror war, of internal war, and the absolute horror of Auschwitz. This Europe had developed democracy, a lot of democratic achievements of civilization, through a history of class struggle, of democratic life, because of the labor movement. This is a Europe, a possible Europe, not the Europe written in the European Constitutional Treaty. This Europe sees the emergence and the vast influence of peace movements, of the no global movements. This Europe can say no to a modernization which does away with civilization. It can avoid falling into a black hole. This Europe can decide to go another way. Let me quote the words of a man, of a comrade, who has found the best words to express his anxiety for the future of humanity. Luigi Pintor. On the newspaper Manifesto on October 10, 2001, Luigi Pintor wrote, "We should forget the idea that this war is similar to the wars that as we experienced them in the last half century. It is not the Third World War yet, as we had imagined it, but it has just the same potential in terms of catastrophe. The spiral between terrorism, war and terrorism, leaves no hope. In 1939, it was difficult to understand what was going on, and to understand that this wouldn't just be a short time. 40 million deaths were necessary in order to turn a new leaf. The deadly rhetoric of war patriotism is deafening among calls to God and new strategies. Victory has no price, no limits. Victory for the strong. Hate will join hate. It will devastate souls more than the bodies are killed. What kind of a future? A future with no future. Terror and war have become normal. We are far away from an understanding of what is happening. I would like to see half of Italy meet in Assisi. I would like to see the highest civilization in the UN found in 3 months a Palestinian state as they created a state of Israel.
It will not happen, but without an instant and universal awareness, the future has no future. I say this, and I shall not apologize in future for having said this reiteratedly. This awareness is potentially destructive of the war and terrorism spiral, and it is today the building of peace. Peace is the North Star of politics in our time. It is not only an absence of war, it is guiding us to the building of the only possible world. A new culture is seeing the light of day. It is affirmed easily and plainly by the masses who become aware, and demonstrate without the need of rigid platforms or powerful organizations, and they start their march. Wasn't this the great demonstration we had on the 19th of February in Rome for the liberation of Giuliana Sgrena? For the release of Giuliana. And to Giuliana we say that we hope that during this Congress we can celebrate your return in our midst. Only those who do not understand this new language of release can think that this demonstration was less politic than others. But here we are faced with new mass movements that contain the announcing of what we can term the reform of politics, taken over by hundreds of thousands of people so that politics can find its place in everyday life, in emotions, feelings, life against death, peace against war and terrorism. The movement was right about everything. The party of war was wrong about everything. War was waged, it was said, because Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Without this motivation, Mr. Bush and his allies would not have been able to wage that war politically. But the weapons of mass destruction weren't there. Occupation forces, therefore, should have withdrawn. And we should think about the paradox which is often recalled, according to which if the U.S. Army were truly wanted to find weapons of mass destruction, it shouldn't look for them in Iraq, but rather in the United States themselves, where there is a stockpile which is the largest in the world. They have ousted Saddam, but he was not the objective, the purpose of the war. But had that been the purpose, albeit concealed, after his fall, they should have left Iraq. And the point that they're there to guarantee security is not applicable. Millions of Iraqi men and women went to the ballots as soon as they could. Others were prevented from doing so by the occupation war and terror. There is a risk of the shattering of the war country owing to the outbreak of religious conflicts. We have learned to turn democracy and voting into the founding elements of politics, and therefore we were moved by Iraqi men and women who went to the ballot boxes and the polling stations. But the end of the occupation is what is required. We should not see the polling stations as a smokescreen to conceal the terrible truth. The war goes on. Dr. Salam Ismail brought aid to Fallujah, and this is how he tells his story to Liberazione, the newspaper. The first thing that struck me was the smell, a stench that was difficult to describe and which I shall never forget, the stench of death. Hundreds of bodies were putrefying in the houses and gardens and along the streets of Fallujah. Bodies decomposed where they fell, bodies of men, women and children. Many had been ravaged by stray dogs. Hate had destroyed 2/3 of the city, razing to the ground houses and mosques, schools and hospitals. This was the terrible power of the fearsome onslaught of the U.S. Army. This is the war of Mr. Bush and his allies. The weapons of mass destruction were not in Iraq. Saddam was not there either, but why does the war go on? The Italian government should quickly withdraw its troops, and this is loudly demanded by people in Italy, as Zapatero did, following France and Germany, who never sent theirs. Why, despite the growth of terrorism, Mr. Bush's war goes on? Why does the war continue despite its being a failure and its crisis? The answer is in the theory of preventive war, the imperial politics of the United States of Mr. Bush, the choice of the unipolar organization of the world and not only of unilateralism. The latter can change. It has to do with the relations between states and political events. But it is the organization, of the world, of preventive war that can be changed, and globalization. And this is the task that Europe should take upon itself if it wants to become a world player on its own. It is a task which is fed by partial or imperfect objectives that but they can still be steps, and it is from this standpoint that we feel very much involved and look towards whatever occurs in the land of Palestine, where any attempt at negotiation to affirm the rights denied to the Palestinian people must be supported and encouraged, even when they are oppressed by a wall, which is an intolerable and systematic act of violence. And we ask that a halt be brought to the building of the wall and that it be removed. Peace is something else. It is the guarantee that we owe to the future of the State of Israel. Peace against war in Palestine as in the world. And I would like to quote a Palestinian intellectual that we feel is close to us, Ali Rashid, to describe a way of acting and the policies that he suggests to his people, which is our way of acting too. Peace is not only the absence of war, because it is war that marks our time, that enters our lives, that shapes human relations and conditions the economy. War is an enemy of humankind, of participation and change. Terrorism is the enemy of humanity, of participation and change. War and terrorism are our enemies. The war-terrorism spiral, as we had intuited, has marked everything that does not oppose it openly. It reaches us in a spreading of violence, of loss in the value attached to human life. The forms of terror multiply, and children and women become targets. Children and women, which is to say, a will to bring about devastation, to undermine the origin of life. The penetration of criminal organizations, mafia, the Camorra, in the large urban sprawl in the south, speak the same language of violence and death. It is not the resurfacing of archaic forms which feeds on war and terror and obtains the prevalence of force and violence and suspension of lawfulness, control of the territory, and self-government, shared community living. The wealth forthcoming from criminal activities are brought into a network and go into uncontrolled financial flows. They become companies and undertakings to control the territory. Undertakings that bring together flexibility and low-cost labor, and furthermore a dependency of the worker who is blackmailed by the criminal network wherein this enterprise develops. And this happens in countries where there are low wages and the economy comes under the contagion of criminal economics. And there is a plunging into hell with the contamination of the economy of culture, of production, of information. And this leads to the solitude of the urban condition, unforeseeable and violence which spreads. There is a crisis in social cohesion. There is a crisis that spreads into the territory. There is a barbarism in daily relations, just like the barbarism of war. Yesterday in the world, the legacy of our victory over Nazism and fascism, albeit undermined by Yalta's building of opposed blocks, however, managed to curb it. And yesterday, another way of limiting it was the commitment in the parties of the left, of the communist and socialist parties, the parishes, and the cultural and intellectual circles. The trenches and bulwarks of the 19th and 20th century have disappeared, or are rather breathless in their resistance. The movements of these years are building new bulwarks, new forms of protection. In the world, with the rebirth of a world movement, there is a new democratic, peaceful, nonviolent power. There are new democratic spaces rising. With the restart of a social conflict, new forms of aggregation, of social living, of disobedience, of self-government. Yesterday, at the end of the last century, it seemed that the game had ended, and some had claimed that the history of capitalism had come to an end. Now the game has started again, and we've come to the very substance of the matter. It's the movements that are now asking, what turn will history take? Where are we heading? We need to feel together this sense of hope and confidence in this new confrontation that bears on the destiny of humankind. And therefore, we have adopted the formula socialism or barbarism. And it is not less forceful because we know what barbarism is. We have learnt it in the world we live in, whereas socialism, the one we want to build, is in itself an open and unfinished quest, not a model for a well-defined future society to be brought into being by seizing power. We have learned that power needs to undergo permanent criticism, whoever wields this power. And this is why we speak of a search, a quest to overcome capitalist society, thanks to movements, thanks to raising questions, finding answers, and checking our steps along the way. We have spoken of socialism and barbarism so as to better describe the challenge lying ahead, to underline the likeness that exists with the turning point of which Rosa Luxemburg spoke, which occurs, she said, when the rule of the bourgeois class does not give rise to progress, historical progress. We have learned that this is a risk, and there is a potential for this coming into being. The fact that it may not be conducive towards either one side or the other of the dilemma does not belie the approach. If there is no perception of impending disaster, one can resort to technical elements that may have some ground, some foundation, but still one remains speechless because peace is our only alternative to disaster. It gives order to the politics of transformation, the revolution, we could say, of our time. Father Balducci understood quite well, both in perceiving the risk and in detecting the way out. He said, the situation is dramatic only because transition, which is the sole alternative to disaster, cannot be the product of the process underway. It requires an additional effort towards creative freedom left to their own purposes or fostered with the ethics of resignation. These processes, Balducci said, will inevitably lead to their natural consequence, which is the destruction of freedom. This creative freedom of which Balducci spoke is the acceptance of peace that gives us our bearing in bringing about change in society. Building peace on the basis of the movements in society, social behavior and human behavior, to involve the policies of states and institutions, and found new forms of organization of society and the economy. New models of development, we could say, if criticism to the paradigm of quantitative development, the one which is measured in GDP, so to say, would not make us critical. The use of the term development itself. It is our task to build peace. We vote for Europe, another Europe, not that of Maastricht or the treaty. It is our Europe is one piece in the mosaic of peace, a Europe which is a dialogue between cultures and civilization, a Europe which draws from the Mediterranean a fundamental lesson, Mare Nostrum, our sea, a sea of diversity and communion. A political Europe which is a player for peace in the world, which contributes to creating a civilization where war is taboo. Europe which rejects war as Article 11 of our Constitution states. Europe, which we want to reject war, as our Constitution says, but as our country, Italy, does not do. A thread of peace that should guide our action, non-violence, participation, democracy. Non-violence is not something we have invented. We have learnt it in the streets of Genoa. When the movement that was menaced by repression and violence has reacted and has pulled this thread through Florence and has come all the way here. And we still harbor sorrow for the killing of Carlo. And we want to bear this sorrow in us as we move towards liberation, away from injustice, oppression, and violence. Far before us, Aldo Capitini and Danilo Dolci spoke of non-violence, and this was not poetry for the naive, nor the reduction of conflict with power or with the system. It's not an exercise in compromise. Actually, it is a social practice, and the subservient classes, masses, multitudes, people can fight without deferring to others. They fight and learn from others. They fight and conquer. They fight and practice the objective. They change society, reality, and ourselves. Non-violence is a pathway of liberation against the violence of power of the system of war. It is an antibody against barbarism. It is participated democracy. Conquering peace is building communities. It is a constant exercise in self-transformation. It is an active social action. It brings about new factors for social cohesion. As stated by Giovanni Franzoni, the community does not exist, but it is endlessly, repeatedly possible. It is concretely possible because, together with the movements and the social conflicts in Italy, new important experiences of participatory democracy came into being. The establishment of new municipal bodies and the representation, municipal representation, people's representation, has led to new institutions, but building peace, and we are far removed from achieving this, means that we want to bring about a change in the social axis. And therefore, we who want Europe need to bring about this change. And with disarmament, we are suggesting what we suggested for labor, to reconvert the economy, a different relationship between production and reproduction, the economy and nature. And this can lead to a Europe of peace. This Europe has no need of an army of its own. But stressing disarmament, Europe could promote a campaign to reduce military spending, for a reconversion of the arms industry and banning weapons of mass destruction, to overcome those military alliances which oblige our countries to become occupied by the military bases of other countries. And in this picture, that Europe could really go beyond NATO. It could gain something in this, because this would strengthen the United Nations. And therefore, there would be a multipolar world where the countries of the third world could hope that at least somewhere in the world they would not be forgotten. That no one just a few weeks or months after the event would forget the disaster of the tsunami, a natural disaster for which we cannot fully claim innocence with our model of imperial model for the organization of the world. Europe should realize that the tidal wave can shatter the rift between rich and poor, and this Europe may perhaps speak to the south of the world. A change in the production, appropriation, domination paradigm is what suggests peace as the very foundation of politics, a rebirth of great politics. The theme of politics calls for change, and this is not an ideological whitewashing, but it is really a response to the anxiety of our life, because another world is possible. And in this picture, characterized by a substantive conflict on the future of civilization, which affects Europe directly and its future, that we should place our problems here in Italy. What is the significance of the confrontation which slowly but forcefully affects our country? What is at stake? What is the object of the challenge? And where do we stand? These are basic, substantive questions. We feel that this conflict has become radical with the crisis of neoliberal policies, the broadening of social opposition, the protest and rage of broad segments of the country which have not received any change. The government just reiterates the neoliberal policies that have already failed. the crisis is ripe, and if there's not a real inversion of the tendency or a change, the outcome of the class, social and political struggle is at stake, the possibility of determining or not its discontinuity, or I would say the break of an entire cycle, and a question that goes well beyond the problem of the political elections of 2006, though it will certainly move through them as well. The first question we need to answer is not whether, in the event of a defeat of Mr. Berlusconi, we should become part of an alternative government, but rather what problem confronts our country and how and who can solve it. The brief cycle, though it seems to have lasted so long that it is intolerable, the brief cycle of the government of the right wing in Italy is in the long cycle of the rule of the neoliberal policies that have accompanied a reorganization of the economy, society, and politics that have lasted 25 years and that have led to this crisis. The problem which confronts us is the following. After 25 years, is it possible to go into social and structural reforms to break this cycle, to open a progressive avenue? Or do we need to go into a democratic and social regression in our civilized rights and enter a long-term period that will void Italy of expectation, hope, everything that was expected and was fought for during the Resistenza, the liberation struggle and anti-fascism? This is the challenge. This challenge is now open and is felt by the Italian people. The social crisis is acute. New generations feel in their own state the future of the country. A confidence crisis is palpable when it comes to our future. For the first time, our children are worse off than their parents. The situation is uncertain, and it bears on the livelihoods of people in the country. This casual and temporary, precarious situation is not an expression of backwardness. It is not the past. It is not something that we cannot become emancipated of, but it is becoming our destiny. It is not the legacy of the past, something that we want to free ourselves of, but it is the expression of modernity, of this neoliberal society. For instance, the mandatory use of the English language when describing the new jobs, the casual jobs, the condition of migrants now. Well, it used to be people who represented the past, and from the past they came into the present of a new country. They had no rights, as they did not have rights in the past. They had low wages, as before others had low wages. It's a low process. It was thought that very slowly equality could be achieved, but now the condition of migrant workers expresses the modernity of servile labor condition, which affects all workers, and the migrant workers are only the harsh facet of the situation. The migrant worker no longer represents the past in a condition that no longer exists for the locals, but it is the situation in which a neoliberal globalization will drag everyone. And this is why the struggle for the rights of citizenship for migrants is a movement for reconstruction of the labor movement and part of a social coalition which can win. Social regression is the future which is proposed to us by capitalistic globalization. Let us look towards the spreading of poverty. In studies, Paul's experiences that are submitted by Caritas and others, we see that there is an alarming situation among the new poor.
These are not just dropouts or homeless people, and there are many stories about them, but this new condition, this new poverty is completely different from the past. There is no longer a gradual coming out of poverty, but the opposite. There's lots of people who might become poor even if they were part of sectors that in the past were protected. Just consider the burden of the cost of health care on increased social insecurity. This health care has been privatized in many aspects because of the new acts and laws that have been adopted, and this healthcare system is increasingly hostile to those who need care. Or think of housing. This is another sign of a failure of neoliberal policies. They have liberalized the housing market, they have privatized a lot of housing, public housing, and yet people's needs for housing are not satisfied. The result is just a monopoly of the major businesses and owners. Italy is lagging behind in the EU in terms of cheap housing, in terms of social housing. Not having a home may mean falling to despair if you're old, or if you are young may mean no future, no possibility to plan your future. Or we could talk about the attack about social security, about the attack against social security and the right to pension and retirement. The policies of the Berlusconi government have a huge influence on the process of social disruption, and that is why it is urgent to have an alternative. Certainly neoliberal policies are not just the result of Berlusconi's. The governments of the center-left had begun along this way, but with moderation. With the Berlusconi government, the whole of Italy has become like the northeast of Italy, an aggressive country which is aggressive outside and inside, but the competitiveness of Italian commodities is just based on cutting costs, cutting labor costs, making flexibility a must, attacking and undermining the welfare state, with some compassionate conservatism, and where systematically the rich are refusing any social responsibility, are just demanding tax cuts. And the social disruption produced by this is huge. There is a deep crisis in the relationship within the government and society and the country. The left, there are too many people, even among the left, who are snobbish and aristocratic and looking to analyzing what Berlusconi is. But in this way, they do not see that there is a plan behind this. There is a logic in Berlusconi's folly. Look at the institutional changes and the kind of power structure that Berlusconi is trying to bring about. It is the old theory of the trilateral. In other words, if democratic structures put forward demands that the system cannot or will not satisfy, then these democratic channels, these democratic structures are to be stopped and blocked. And so it's a systematic attack against any system of checks and balances and independent bodies, attacking the independence of parliament, of the judiciary, of the trade unions, of local authorities. They're attacking any form of independence, any possibility for people to decide about their own life. So they're attacking these independent bodies, this form of independence, and they're attacking some central pillars of democracy, such as culture and information and radio and television. The government is putting forward changes in the constitution whereby if there is a conflict between the head of government and parliament, the result is not a government crisis, but the head of government closing down parliament. So this plan is very dangerous, and we should be aware of this danger, understanding the links among the various aspects of politics. Italian neoconservatives are a very specific brand of them. They are upholding the cause of war, while at the same time rediscovering the sacred nature of politics in the use of force. But this is blasphemy. They are building up an ideology. Just consider the law on assisted procreation. This is a form of religious fundamentalism. They are whereby the state is forcing its own ethics on human beings. There's some cruelty in this legislation, harassing mothers-to-be. But the basic principle of the law is reactionary. Women should not have free choice about whether to become mothers or not. For this reason, we have joined forces with a radical party and other forces demanding that there should be a referendum to repeal this law. We uphold a coalition saying that women are protagonists, and this is a battle for freedom that in this referendum. There's a major danger in this ideology of the right wing. Remember the electoral campaign which brought Bush the victory. Defeating Berlusconi requires a cultural struggle against this politics, against this ideology. We should have our own values and ideology against that of the right wing. That is why peace is our guiding principle. But this cultural struggle should concern the daily life of individuals and populations and peoples. A practical, radical critique of the present working and living conditions, demanding a process of social and economic reforms to change the present state of affairs. There's a triad of legislation in the action of the Berlusconi government which described its notion of society. Act number 30 on the labor market, Bossi-Fini Act on immigration, and Moratti Act on education. The idea, the principle in these acts is the idea that labor is a dependent variable depending from competitiveness. With Act number 30, the casualization of work has become legislation. It even replaces collective bargaining and collective agreements and national labor contracts. Attacking labor contracts means making it impossible for the workers to be united and have bargaining power through collective bargaining. So Act number 30 is corroding the notion of collective bargaining. As for the Bossi-Fini Act, it violates fundamental civil rights of migrants. It denies their right to citizenship. It makes them totally subordinate to their employers. Migrants are seen as a weak link of the chain to be used to push all the workers towards casualization, informal economy, and unprotected labor. Well, Minister Moratti thought that if the vast majority of the workers are only to expect casual employment and to be working poor, then why waste money in mass education, in government education? That Act, the Moratti Act, is the end of the hope that there could be quality mass education. They just protect the upper strata, which could have excellent schooling, but it's just a small group of students who will become the ruling class. Or the rest of the pupils and students are downgraded. Their education is just downgraded to vocational trading. This is the reason for that insult to the right of education, which is forcing 12-year-olds to decide what kind of schooling, what kind of future. But when you're 12, you do not choose. It's your family that chooses, and families are blackmailed. It is not families that make the choice. It is the family's budget. It is the family's earnings that decide. If you're not rich, if you're not wealthy, you'll be excluded and cut off from education. This is called class discrimination.
È giusto e necessario ribellarsi.
Rebelling against this is right. And with so much of the social movement, and together with many other social, trade union and political forces, we want to repeal Act number 30, we want to repeal the Bossi-Fini Act on Migration, we want to repeal the Moratti Act on Education. There is nothing extremist in these demands. If you're following a path and you're stopped by heavy hurdles that block your way, what are we to do but doing away with these hurdles? These counter-reforms, these hurdles are a task that the new government should carry out to be an alternative against Berlusconi. So this is a way of reform, giving value to labor and to culture, and to a creative relationship between labor and culture. We must defeat Berlusconi, but at the same time we must defeat and change Berlusconi's policies. Berlusconi is not just a short-term experience in the history of our country, after which everything will be okay. Berlusconi is part of a world right wing, and he has links with Bush. He is not alien from Italy. He is the face of one of the faces of Italy. Behind this right-wing government, we see the condition of the country. We see the present state of affairs with our ruling class. We see what Italian capitalism is like. Globalization has highlighted the crisis of Italian capitalism and has accelerated the decline of Italian capitalism. Government policies have further accelerated this bankruptcy. But this capitalism continues to adopt policies which have failed. Private industrial corporations have almost disappeared. With all this talk about privatizing, the only big industries which are still on the arena are government-owned. And the Fiat case is a symbol of the failure, of the bankruptcy of the bourgeoisie in this country. They had demanded to be freed from the constraints of the workers' collective bargaining power or from public control. When they have freed from those fetters, Fiat has fallen into a major crisis. Without public intervention, strategic research is defeated. The illusion that small is beautiful has broken up, faced with a world market influenced by the dollar and by the ascent of China and by the rise of China. An export-oriented economy, an economy which is only export-oriented, which no longer uses the leverage of domestic markets, comes to a standstill. As Luciano Gallino Luciano Gallino posed the question. Either Italian corporations believe that Italian wages can be as low as that of the Chinese workers, or they have to choose a different road. In which direction? The international center-left, as advocated in the 90s, is not feasible. There's no point in repeating the debate we had at the time. Globalization, innovation will not continue to grow, even if new rules are adopted, and it will not redistribute wealth and rights. Even major leaders, reformist leaders, have acknowledged that in those years they were somewhat attracted by liberal policies. We cannot go back to those times. We cannot go back to the times before Berlusconi. The crisis and decline of our country demand that we plan major policy of reforms. This is an unprecedented turning point in the history of our country, and this concerns the whole of Europe. Italy is a very specific case in Europe. Hence, the conflict here is highly significant in a European perspective as well. The conflict and the crisis is more acute here than elsewhere, in France or Germany. It is an essential conflict, and a lot of other conflicts depend on its results. We, the Union, the Alliance, need to advocate and advance our notion of society and of what Europe should be like in 5-10 years' time. We need to develop new instruments for political action, a new role for public authorities in order to pursue reform. This is the only way to develop democratic participation in writing the agenda of the alliance, of the Unione. Without this, the crisis could mean but that the country just follows the law of the jungle. It would mean Americanizing Italy without development. There is this danger. The employers are less and less, feel less and less sense of responsibility towards society, and the fact that they delocate and transfer production is a sign of this. Strategic decision making about businesses and about corporations is increasingly moved elsewhere. If the employers of the Terni steel mills are in Terni, they can be influenced by the fact that the workers are mobilizing, that the whole community is mobilizing. But if the owners of the company are elsewhere, they may pay no attention to that local community of Terni. And if public powers are hiding, if they're not standing up to their responsibilities, if they pursue neoliberal bureaucracy, the situation is even more dangerous. That dispute at Terni ended with a trade union agreement. It is important that it is a victory because they have defended and maintained workers' jobs, but they have lost an important segment of the steel production in Terni, the so-called magnetic steel, and this is a loss for the industrial policy of the party. Italian capitalism in a globalized world is following the dream to go back to the 19th century. The crisis of neoliberal policy has not meant that those policies have been left behind, because there is a crisis in the ruling class of our country. So we need politics, we need a political plan, a political project to develop a new economic and social model in Italy and in a new Europe. This is necessary because Italy is at a crossroads. And this is a structural reason, the very foundation for our conflict against the right wing, and this conflict is visible in the whole of Italy. We need a clear alternative plan. That is why there is unity and competition between us and reformists. Both unity and competition. Reformists often tend to take into their hands what they call the helm of the alliance, of the Unione, the guidance. They want to be the leading force in the alternative against Berlusconi. I understand why they do this, but I don't agree. I don't think we should claim the same. I don't think we should react to this by claiming that we want the helm in our hands. No, we should not reclaim that helm, that rudder for us. The Unione, the alliance, should be led by the whole people of the alliance. And the guidance, the leading force of the Union, should be developed through democracy and participation. And I believe that Romano Prodi's leadership itself would gain a lot from increased participation and democracy. The lesson learned in Puglia belongs with Puglia, but everyone can clearly understand the meaning of the victory of Nichi Vendola. This is not the victory of one side, of one grouping. It is not the victory of one leader, a radical leader, a communist leader, our own comrade. It is the victory of his own roots, of his being embedded and rooted with the people of Apulia. So it is a victory of the people and of participation. So the leadership of the alliance will be in the hands of whoever gives an effective answer to these two questions: how to oust Berlusconi's government and how to develop an alternative to Berlusconi and to Berlusconi's policies. And a further question is a must. Can we have a role in the real political struggle of the country at mass level without responding to what our own people want and demand, to oust Berlusconi's government? There's a very clear answer to this. No, we cannot. Any force that does not contribute to achieving this result would be wiped out from politics and from any relationship with the masses in our country, and correctly so. Rifondazione Comunista has gained an important political role and has gained influence on the course of events in this political season because we have very clearly stated that this is what we want and we're willing to play our part. And this has increased the level of opposition against Berlusconi. In this way, we have been able to contribute to developing a united alternative to the right wing in every region. These are highly political elections at regional level. Only in one region, in Tuscany, we do not have this unity because of the prejudice and veto by the olive tree grouping. But we have unity in all the other regions. And in Puglia, we have seen the beautiful role of participatory democracy. The person who is running for president comes from our own ranks, from the radical left, and he represents a whole coalition. Good luck, Nichi. Because we have taken this decision, we have an important role in many regions. In Lombardy, the experience of Alta Lombardia, with important experiences of new participation. And because we've taken this decision, we can advocate and advance major issues and be open to participation, to the participation of social movements, trade union movements, labor movements, civil society. We have been asked whether we want to be united in order to defeat the right wing. We said yes, we want to be united to defeat the right wing. Now we should advance an agenda for the social reform of our country. We want to defeat the right wing, not just because of the terrible things that the right wing has done and the terrible damage to our country, but we want to defeat the right wing because we are advocating an alternative society. This is the only way to avoid that perverse law of the pendulum which seems to have affected Europe. We need to leave behind this swing of the pendulum and express a demand for change. This law of the pendulum, this swinging, means that when the right wing stays in government long enough, then people become unhappy, and there are so many people who are unhappy, then they demand a change, and their demands, their expectations are towards the left wing. But if the left wing wins the elections, and if the policies of the left in government are similar to those of the right wing, then there's a major crisis of confidence, and people turn their backs to politics, and there's a crisis of politics. This is precisely what happened in the most recent rounds of election in most of the countries of continental Europe. Well, we must do away with this swinging pendulum. We must oust Berlusconi, but at the same time we should advance deep reforms. This is our political objective. I understand that some parts of our party are concerned and worried about the question of government because of our experiences in Italy and abroad. We must be cautious, but there's no protection against risk. The only protection is through the fact that we build some social links and movements that will foster and advance reform. But the first question concerns us. What political culture do we use to advance these views, to turn this turning point? In these years, we have lived in social movements, so the key point for us should not be government. Our focus, we should not be focused on government, but on participation, on people's participation, on democracy. And therefore, our focus should be the attempt to build the reform of the country through the participation, through the engine of civic movements and conflicts and disobedience. In these years we have developed a new political culture whereby we criticize the central role of political power and political institutions. And our critique of power and of the mechanisms of power should concern our own governments too. It's part of our project of change. We have changed our political culture through our relationship with social movement, through our presence in social movements. For us, being in government is not a political goal. nobody can play a part, can have a role in the left without advancing the force necessary to oust the Berlusconi government. Therefore, we should contribute to develop an alternative for the government. The presence of our party in a new parliamentary majority, the presence of our party in a new government is not what we're aiming for. It is the instrument we want to use to advance reform and changes in our country, in social reality, in the institutions of our country.
Veniamo ora all'altro quesito su cui si gioca lo scontro tra la destra e l'unione nel Paese, ma anche...
Let me come to another question, which concerns a conflict between right and left, but also the challenge between reformists and radical left. How do we overcome this crisis and the decline of the country? Because of the nature of this crisis, we believe that the way out of it is not some small correction in this system, but an alternative society, an alternative notion of society, a new era of social reform, of economic and democratic reform. So we need to change the paradigm. And this is very difficult. It's not something that can be done overnight or even in the course of 1 year. Such a major reform is difficult and complex. So we have to accept that change is gradual. But at the same time, as we advance gradual changes, we must be highly radical in our critique of the present state of affairs and in our determination to advance deep changes. And the position of our country and of Europe in this challenge is very important. The Mediterranean should be our central focus, and this is an antidote against the clash of civilization. It is also a major contribution to a dialogue, interreligious dialogue. This is a bridge we want, not the bridge over the Messina Strait. We want the Mediterranean to be a platform for peace, to be a bridge of dialogue between Europe and the Arab countries. The South would have a new historical chance, not to be colonized by the north of the world, but to develop its own resources with a new economy. This is happening with a new value given to intelligent enterprise in a new relationship with land and culture.
And not only for certain quality wines or quality products can we grow. The growth of material and immaterial goods can increase. The increase in the relations between consumers and producers. Quality agriculture can grow with the wisdom and science in ancient cultures that can speak to the future of a humanity which is not subservient to GMOs or mad cows or the multinational corporations of plunder. There is a rediscovery of the world which shapes for it a favorable environment, as the meeting of Terra Madre indicated, a meeting organized by the Slow Food Movement in Turin, where 5,000 farmers from the world over convened and spoke the language of rebirth in agriculture. The environment becomes part of the economy and requires deep innovation similar to the one required. There are services that do not want to be consumer services only. So many goods and services do not want to die, but should be made available to the entire community and become goods for common use. This is proposed by cultural exception, which requires the protection of cultural goods from external colonization as a social organization in the areas of training, welfare, and education. People can make the entire city growth, remove from the market to give to the community, to give back goods and services through society. This is nothing we are inventing. This was done by the workers' movement, by conquering welfare. And now all this is being denied, and this is leading to a crisis. It is necessary to defend old gains and explore at the same time new territories. And two are paramount for us to overcome neoliberal policies and respond to the new demands forthcoming from movements, common goods, and the right to universal citizenship inside and outside the world of labor. An extraordinary experience is growing thanks to the world contract, or the many initiatives in the land, in the struggle against privatization, in meetings of people and experts, a new culture of public being, the universal rights of citizenship, from the right to democracy and social conflict, should represent the endowment of society, a special knapsack that contains one's own rights in the world of labor and everyday life. Common good and right to universal citizenship are the two pillars of a new social democratic compromise to redefine the mixed character of the economy of the country and of Europe. To redefine all this, what is required is a new programming which would define the new tasks of the public authorities, and also a true and full employment in quality jobs. And the public sphere should contribute to this, and alongside that, shared objectives should be set at given conditions with the same system of the enterprises, such as aiming for the increase in employment in the country. And in this, there should not be collectivist economies, but powerful capitalistic economies in forms different from that of France or the Scandinavian countries are safeguarding the strategic axis of the country. Facts die hard if one wants to deal with the crisis of fiat. Thinking about the fate of workers, public intervention will become required as the situation becomes ever more serious. From the conditions of the population, from the state of the country, from the traditional sectors such as those of innovation, to affirm choices for the future which are different. From all these there is a call for a new reform. And in the area of taxes, there should not be a reformism of the rich in favor of those who are in a situation of privilege, as Mr. Berlusconi did, but according to social justice, according to the needs to fund objectives which are socially useful. Taxes are neither good nor bad in themselves. It all depends on whether they provide good services and free of charge to the entire community. It depends on whether they correct distributive injustice and rebalance the distribution of income in favor of workers and the low and medium low incomes. It all depends. What it does not depend is the judgment on the Italian fiscal system, where tax evasion have reached levels which would be a scandal in any other countries and are unknown in other countries. Many years ago, a well-known bourgeois, Bruno Visentini, who was Minister of Finances, said that the fiscal system was revolting. Many years have elapsed, and it is only more revolting. It is necessary to have a clear sign of change. If the word capital gains, taxing, is considered horrendous, we shall not use it, but the country is bogged down. It has tremendous wealth, which is often unproductive. We suggest that there be a fiscal approach, a coordinated one, on profit, which enjoys an intolerable privileged condition vis-à-vis wages. To fund a strategic research plan for the future. And in this regard, we would like to hear what the productive bourgeoisie has to say. Or is alliance with profit worth more than a strategic resource for the entire country? Any discourse on the redistribution of income is not to be based on taxes but on salaries. The increase in prices has lowered the purchasing power of wages and salaries. It is hard to for people to make do, and many people are now aware that something has to be done about wages and salaries, but nothing happens. We cannot wait for Berlusconi to fall. Trade unions have their platform. We would like the union to have a campaign for the mobilization of the purchasing power, the increase of salaries, wages and pensions, and for social salaries as well. The Great Reform is a prospect for Europe. It could be the start for a new era for Italy. It is necessary, this is clear, but the question is it also possible? We believe that the answer is yes, not on the basis of a mere wish, but on the basis of what has changed in Italy over these years, how civil society has come to have new experiences, requests, expectations, and not only in the world, as we said, but in Italy too. At the end of last century, the game was over, apparently, in terms of change. But the so-called Italian case, to define an exceptional increase of participatory democracy and social change, was a closed chapter. But now in Italy too, at the start of the new century, the game is open, and the movements have opened the game, starting with the so-called No Global Movement. We have discussed this at length, and we shall continue to look into its nature and growth. And the perception is confirmed that the movement has given itself, and that has opened to the entire world, to the south of the south. They were the protagonists in Bombay, the perception of a lasting movement, something to last. And this has become confirmed. The peace movement has taken off from there and gone beyond. And the rainbow banners that accompanied it were hoisted and lowered in the various passages, but never lowered altogether. And peace is the main antagonist of war and terrorism. It feeds collective subjectivity and aims for their defeat. Social conflict has re-emerged against the neoliberal policies in specific and general struggles that saw the unions become organized. In Italy, in these recent years, millions of workers, men and women, have been involved. And in this framework, a new subjectivity has become affirmed, new players, new forms of political militancy in the movement. And I would like to quote the largest industrial trade union of the country, FIOM, or the greatest association, the ARCI, which from Genoa onwards have built a new history. I'm thinking about our past experience in social struggle, from Scansano to Acerra, from Terni to Terlizzi, from a radical labor conflict to a struggle for the environment. They had been announced by struggles that had been defeated, but which nonetheless paved the way for a new season. I would like to recall in this connection the mass vote in favor of extending Article 18 with a referendum. But here I would like to recall Melfi, the event that occurred there. The social conditions in the factory of Melfi had started 10 years before. Lower wages than other Fiat workers, unbearable working shifts, and the work burden as well was very high. This happened and went on for 10 years, and the workers never spoke out, but some people were working for the rebirth of the conflict and protagonism of workers. And we personally would like to remember a comrade and friend, Claudio Sabatini. After 10 years, there was a strike when the workers, men and women, said enough is enough. And they promoted an unusual strike, because it wasn't an articulated strike, but one without end against the violence of the controlling powers of repression. But they stressed non-violence. The buses to take the workers to the factory remained empty, and the slogan was "Resist 1 minute longer than the owner." Why then? For many reasons. The first of which is that the winds have changed. The winds blowing from the south, those of the encounter between what is happening in the south and the long wave of the movements have met. But the wind of change is not enough, nor is it enough to have the bringing together and contamination of the positions of the various movements and the left, or the shattering of the boundary line between reformers and radicals, or new forms of political cooperation, such as the consultation chamber, or experience of certain new magazines such as Carta, Aprile, and Alternative. We would like this collaboration now to take the shape of a foundation, so as to recall a wonderful person we marched together with since Genova, but who unfortunately is no longer with us, Tom Benetollo.
No, non basta tutto questo, seppure tanto.
what has happened with the movement is not enough. There have been delays in the building process, and it is not enough to comment on the status of the movement and the relationship between the movement and the harshness of the process surrounding us. And we cannot escape voicing criticism. We proceed at different speeds. We have the real processes, the choices made by governments and the powers that be, and on the other hand, we have the growth of movements. It is a problem which exists worldwide in Europe and elsewhere. It is a major political problem. The masses, the people of peace move, but terrorism works its toils of death. Strikes, demonstrations, but contracts are denied. Homes are occupied, but rents are increased. I mentioned Melfi because it's just one of the many struggles. There are so many struggles in the country, thousands of situations which draw us out of the neoliberal policies and give rise to unprecedented experiences that we could term a new civilization. But we might be overcome by the trend. There's no miracle solution to problems, but a broad participation of the movement worldwide and in Europe point towards something which is necessary. Firstly, to work politically for the growth of the movement, both in favor of presence throughout the territory and also to promote the organization of new, original and stable forms of participated democracy. The connection, the network of movements can become a reality that keeps social conflicts, movements for peace, non-global movements stable, tied together towards building a pluralistic and unitarian transformation of reality. It is necessary to move forward. If May the 1st, May Day, will come together in the labor, in the celebrations of labor with unitarian demonstrations, this could be a good start. And then the second point brings us to the government. On the one hand, one requires a reform policy given from the top down, but on the other hand, with a new alternative government, reform policies can go from the bottom upwards. Social control over labor, the birth of forms of self-government, the establishment of new realities for the economy, valuing people, the environment and culture. And therefore, an alternative to the Berlusconi government should have as its first program point to promote democracy and promote autonomy. Promote democracy, that of workers in the workplace, first and foremost. We are suggesting an unexplored approach, an approach of deep innovation, and we're suggesting this to those we have walked along over the years, with whom we have shared action and search. The idea that pushes us forward is the idea that in the country, movements and struggles can have an incidence on strategic choices and material processes. And the aim is to build politics that are well pondered and practiced, so that the change of capitalistic society may become part of the politics of today. When we thought about another Europe, we built the Party of the European Left, and we see it grow with the support of comrades, men and women, intellectuals, militants, men and women who are not card-carrying members of Rifondazione but are interested in the project. And we see it grow in our campaigns in Europe, where the Party of the European Left has the same themes and objectives in the many countries of Europe. In the campaign against the treaty and the European Constitution, in the name of the Europe we truly need. Faced with this new prospect that the Congress has encouraged us to pursue, we feel a need to contribute to create in Italy a radical left which is capable of being a unitarian, pluralistic player involved in building a reformed cycle where radically and gradually process and transformation and democracy and change come together. We are against organization proposals if they're limited to the parties. We are of a different opinion. We believe that a radical leftist force, an alternative force, can take shape to react to the crisis of politics, implementing a reform of politics, recognizing the plurality of experiences in the many different forms of organization that politics have assumed: parties, associations, social expressions, trade unions, communities, newspapers, research bodies, and also recognizing the different forms that militants are assuming. An alternative left does not only require a leap forward into political culture, but also in refounding the forms of politics, programmed convergencies, especially with that we have discussed with the DS comrades, can be an obstacle to seeking together if we do not compare our positions, our initiatives. We need to work and search together. This is what we intend to do, and we intend to proceed all the way, being open as possible, available, ready for cooperation, and all we ask is to work together. The parties of the European left and of the alternative left are part of the same research, albeit differently for us. The research of a party, that of Rifondazione Comunista, which works on itself and at the same time vis-à-vis others, those who are interested in this joint research. And we also propose that jointly we, from the left, need to overcome the crisis of the workers' movement, to become players in an alternative left, to come out of our minority situation and become players and protagonists in the life of the country and of Europe. That is our role. The politics of unity and competition against the reformist left is based on a real requirement of the country and can be carried out successfully on our part only from this standpoint, which is that of building an alternative left that gives back to politics the ability of changing our lives and society in the world. I have now finished, comrades. we shall dedicate to the state of the party all the care we're capable of in a demanding conference, which would be an organizing conference. So I won't speak about this here, but allow me to say only one thing. This is my last report to a Congress of the party, of the Partito di Rifondazione Comunista. I would like to say that we are happy because we are satisfied with a result that I consider exceptional for us all. At the start of this Congress, we were moved by something that we are amazed of. The joining of the most prestigious leader of the Italian left, Pietro Ingrao, to the Partito della Rifondazione Comunista. A communist leader who has lived through the post-war period and has been a protagonist and has given us an extraordinary, untainted lesson and a dream for the future. And we have also received a gift to the directorate of the party of a new generation of militants, those of Genova, the first, so to say, autochthonous generation, and therefore open to the world, a generation of rebels, disobedient and communist. And communist because it is disobedient and rebel. And communists because they are disobedient and rebels, a fruit, if I may say so, of the connection between the rifts, the turns, the refoundation of the culture of Rifondazione Comunista, starting from the lessons of feminism and the ongoing active presence in the movements. A few years ago, if one wanted to say something ambitious for the culture of the party, well, one pointed towards a remote objective, which was that of overcoming the cultures of origin, the different areas in which the comrades had been militants, to give rise to a policy that would prevail them all, a political culture that could be shared. A few weeks ago in a Congress, I quite rightly heard being stressed the overcoming of those cultures and their feeding into the culture of Rifondazione. And I understood. For many of those who attended the Congress, many of them were young, some things are taken for granted. They don't really cause any motion. And I would like to thank everyone, the comrades, men and women, who have made this possible, even when it was thought to be a problem and remote. And I would like to extend my thanks to someone who was very dear to us, Livio Maitan.
Ora qui siamo giunti.
This is now where we stand, and this is where we are faced with the future of Rifondazione Comunista. We have a new generation of comrades who can steer it in the center and in the outskirts. We have this inspiration of unity and radicality, renewal and tradition. new research and communism, centrality and movements, the choice of being in or out. In or out. The processes marked by the prevalence of the opponents has always persecuted communist socialists of the left, with the risk of seeing an alternation in the emerging of criticism when one is outside the power process, and then see it drop drastically. And this critical attitude disappear and move to acceptance when one is inside. This generation, I believe, has learned from the movement what is essential: to be in reality, in the real world, but with the maximum of critical attitude to influence reality and change it. Try and try again, Gramsci said, is the task of a revolutionary. I would it to be the culture of Rifondazione, but there's a new generation that now is present in the reality and leadership of Rifondazione. A lovely poster announced the Congress of the party in Naples. It was a highly dynamic picture. There was tension, it was intense, and there was an expression of solidarity and participation. It was a sporting event, a relay race, and the muscles of the forearms push two hands forwards. They are passing the relay, and there is this exchanging from hand to hand, this handing over, and now the torch is in good hands. Have a good race, comrades.
Grazie. 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 Grazie.
Grazie, voglio bene.
Thank you. I love you all.
Grazie, grazie. Grazie a tutti, grazie tantissimo.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Scusate, che dobbiamo fare?
No, devo leggere...
No, un momento però, perché
Devo leggere il presentazione.
un attimo solo.
Perché sennò altrimenti tutti quanti hanno poi
Dobbiamo mettere.
Sì.
altrimenti segretari.
Aspetto Fausto per dire. Devo tra qualche...
In a couple of seconds, I have to read to you the answer that we have received. Our Secretary, Fausto Benteranotti, sent a message to the President of the Republic, and we've just received the answer, and I'd like to read it to you. And I'd also like to inform comrades that as soon as we finish the session, there will be a reception that everyone can attend on the second floor of the next door with all the foreign delegations, and then at 9 o'clock the Congress committees will begin to work, and at 9:30 the various groupings and supporters of the motions shall meet. So the grouping supporting motion number 1 shall meet here, whereas the supporters of motion number 2 are meeting in 20 minutes in the room Perla, next door, Palazzo del Casino. I would like to ask the TV cameramen and journalists, please let us continue, because this is something important.
Naturalmente tra qualche minuto voteremo anche la composizione delle commissioni.
We'll vote on the composition of commissions as well.
Assolutamente impraticabile. Pensavo che per fare l'ultima relazione mi llegasse qualche minuto in più del campo. 3 ore l'hai fatto, hai fatto 2. Beh, bello. Sì. C'è solo l'illusione di essere l'inizio degli anni 60, no? Piccolo particolare che vabbè, esige nessuno.
Scusate, le compagne e i compagni delegati devono restare in sala, riprendere posto perché dobbiamo votare e saranno fatte anche delle comunicazioni importanti.
Io devo leggere la cosa per Presidente della Repubblica.
Allora ci vediamo domani, grazie.
Ciao, sono Mussolino di Rinascita.
Sì.
Senti, domani quando intervieni? Lo sai più o meno?
Il secondo, perché
La
si
mattina?
dovrebbe fare la mattina comunque, perché si
ok.
fa le varie mozioni.
No,
domani
era più o
mattina.
meno capire, ecco, quindi la mattina.
Adesso ci mettiamo d'accordo su chi parla domani per noi, se sono io o se è Cannavò.
Ok, dopo l'intervento tuo di Cannavò ti possiamo prendere Dico, ecco, dopo che parli tu.
Però mai mi limito a fare questo. La mozione continua a rappresentare.
Ti cerco domani.
D'accordo, grazie.
Compagne e compagni, riprendiamo posto.
Please take your seats.
Sedetevi.
Please, comrades, take your seats.
Vabbè, ma sono cretini perché